Welcome back to Social 20-1. Today we're looking at Lesson 4, the second half of the long 19th century. The first half we looked at the year 1789 up to the Napoleonic era. Today we're going to look at some of the outcome of the Napoleonic era with the Congress of Vienna and the reestablishment of the conservative order, and ultimately we'll work our way towards the the outbreak of World War I. So the first outcome we have is explore the Congress of Vienna, and the main concept that we need to associate with the Congress of Vienna is that they're trying to undo the French Revolution. That at Vienna, the nobles of Europe are meeting, and they're trying to I often refer to it as put the genie back in the bottle, and the genie is nationalism. We're trying to reestablish the old order, and in France this means finding a king or a monarch to put back on the crown, and in order to protect their own monarchies they believe that we need to restore the French monarchy. So that's the agenda at the Congress of Vienna, is reestablishing the conservative feudalistic order of legitimacy based upon the divine right, rather than allowing the will of the people to be expressed. So this is a counter against nationalism. We also will see in this lesson that the time of revolution isn't over in Europe, that there's going to be more revolutions as there is a continuance of enlightenment and people wanting to reestablish their relationship with each other and with their governments. We'll also see the balance of Europe. The balance of Europe, it's 100% okay. Yeah. We'll also see the balance of Europe reestablished by the Congress of Vienna, and they're going to create some lasting peace. The concert of Europe, they're going to describe it as. But this lasting peace is going to be disrupted by the rise of Italy and Germany, which we might call the new kids on the block. Even though Germany has been the dominant power in Central Europe for 1,000 years in the form of the Holy Roman Empire and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Germans now have this sense of nationalism from being occupied by the French, and they seek to create their own nation state based upon nationalism. And while we study Italy and Germany, it gives us a chance to look at the foreign policy of Realpolitique, which is the idea of let's do what's practical instead of what's moral. Let's do what is to our best interest, rather than having absolutes like we're never going to ally with them kind of thing. And ultimately we're going to identify the main causes of World War I, which MAIN, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So here we go. Once again, if we see anything in red, that's an assignment. The purple thing are the outcomes, and green would be the key information, and anything this time in gray, that's extra. So when we look at the Congress of Vienna, the goals, again, the restoration of the royal family, restoration of the conservative order, restoration of feudalism. We call this the Metternich or the Metternich system because the prince in charge of the Congress of Vienna, the Austrian prince, his last name, Metternich. So the Metternich system is to combat the French virus, and the French virus was nationalism. And the fear is that when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. In that metaphor, the sneeze was the revolution and the cold was nationalism. And the nobles of Europe, they could see how it was infecting them. So they wanted to mask up and prevent the spread of this contagion by putting the genie again back in the bottle and putting a monarch back on the crown, or the throne in France. Conservative order. Not everyone desired the return to inequality, which would be feudalism, right? And the loss of their new liberties. Therefore, Europe will have 2 more rounds of significant revolutions. At the Congress of Vienna, we will see that balance of power that I mentioned, that this has a negative effect on nations seeking independence, because the empires are saying, nope, if we just stop here, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, the French Empire, then if we just stop here, the Ottomans, then we might have stability and peace in Europe. We might have no need for war. But within these empires, within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, within the Ottoman Empire, we have peoples that want sovereignty. They want self-determination. They want independence. They want nationhood. And their desire for nationhood, infected by the cold of France, the nationalism, will upset the order and lead to World War I. Here's another outline that you can skim through to talk about the Congress of Vienna if you're having troubles understanding what I said about them. I'm going to go ahead and change that to green. And there's always some enrichment stuff that I put in there if you wanted to take a few more minutes on it. There is a 15-minute video that is extremely well done on the Metternich system and the return of conservatism by the guy who looks a lot like Jason Bourne, Saving Private Ryan, the dude that we left on Mars. You know what I mean. Ben Affleck's little buddy. So if you want to take a 15-minute journey down the look at the Metternich system, I would say this is an important video to watch. So opposing ideologies is something we often talk about in social studies. So the clash of ideologies in the beginning of, or the middle, I guess, of this long 19th century is an ideology of, do we want conservatism and feudalism, or do we want liberalism and nationalism? And that's what's clashing in Europe at this time. Again, we're going to look at some revolutions of the 19th century, and there's a Prezi here that you can watch if you don't get it. And here's a must-see video by the same Jason Bourne that it's only 6 minutes long this time. Please watch the video. It's an excellent summary of these revolutions, as too is this slide share. So you should be able to go through this document here, and by going through it, it'll tell you more about the revolutions of the 19th century. And I have to admit, people talk about the French Revolution, they talk about it at great length, but we forget about the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. And there's some great visuals in here that sum up, what causes the revolution and what is the effect of the revolution. And without giving things away too much, when I'm looking to make multiple choice questions, these visuals here, those charts especially, pretty easy for me to borrow that information and make it into a multiple choice source. So you don't need to know everything that's in this document, but I would definitely focus on the simplicity of this is the place of these revolutions in 1830, this is what caused it, this is the effect. That's a great one. This is also a very strong one that looks at the impact, the changes that result from them. And then this document also looks at the birth of Germany and Italy, which is a topic we're about to slide into. And again, we can see some reform movements. And I think those are important, even if they're not tested. Those are important moving forward. Here's a nice visual that you might see in a future A1 or a future multiple choice test. And try to unpack it, see if you can see what forces are at odds here, and see, after you looked at the information on the revolutions, see if you can see how this is an illustration of the revolutions. See if you can see how it's an illustration of the clash of ideologies between conservatism and feudalism and the old regime against elements of nationalism and young nations trying to break free of empires. And then we have Realpolitique, right? So when we look at the rise of Germany, a new kid on the block that's going to upset the balance of power, the German government, mostly under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, they will practice a system of Realpolitik in the sense of we're going to make practical alliances rather than moral or ideological ones. And sometimes the practical alliances help create stability in Europe, but sometimes these practical German alliances may actually lead to more conflict. So we do have a balance of power at the time, the balance of power doctrine, If there's a balance of power, then no one side has the ability to challenge the other. And when you have new states emerging, like Germany or like Italy, it has the potential to offset the existing balance of power that they tried to achieve through the Peace of Europe at the Congress of Vienna. So there's additional information about the unification of Germany and the unification of Italy. And again, we have a nice video from Jason Bourne there. And I'm going to go ahead and make that green and tell you, please watch that 9-minute video because he does an excellent job. You could make a quick timeline. I know it's in red. That makes it look like an assignment for sure. I think that, let's put it into your notes, but you don't have to hand that in to me today. Here's some further information about the policy of Realpolitique. If you still don't understand what it means, it's defined there again. It comes from Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. He was a powerful ruler. He believed that there's no room for idealism. He had to do what was practical. Here are the alliances in that concept of balance of power. Now, at this time in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, for the most part, the British Empire were practicing splendid isolationism. They turned their back on the continent of Europe, and they focused on their empire. And their empire during this time, as we know from Social 10, the sun will never set on it. It'll cover a quarter of the Earth's surface. So in isolation, it truly was splendid for Great Britain. There will be times that they'll meddle with European affairs when the Russians get involved in expansion into the Crimea, but for the most part, Britain will focus on her empire. Now we get up to the causes of the First World War, and legitimately main: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. You need to be able to list them, you need to be able to define them, and you need to be able to give evidence, examples to show what they mean. There's a very quick 6-minute video here that'll help you with that. So take some notes from that video. We also have some notes that I've already put in here for you. This looks at the alliance system, and one of the things to note with the alliance system is that often the alliances are in secret, so we don't know whose side somebody's on. So there may appear to be an opportunity to create a conflict, but that's only because you don't understand how entangled the alliances are. So once you created a conflict with country X, you didn't know country Y would get pulled in. And because country Y gets pulled in, now Z is pulled in as well. So one of the reasons why the war beginning in August of 1914 escalates into a global war is because of entangling alliances and responsibilities, diplomatic responsibilities, to come to the aid of others. Militarism, this idea that we use military might to solve our problems. There's no international arena for diplomacy. We might call this international lawlessness then, that the idea is that how do we settle our disputes? Might is right, through militarism. So at the turn of the 20th century, we have an arms race between the Germans and the British. As a manifestation of this arms race is mostly the building of dreadnoughts, warships, as the Germans tried to find their place in the sun and compete with the might of the British Empire. And the arms race and the expenditures in military at some point have to be justified, right? You have to justify them by using those weapons. And what does that mean? It means going to war. There's more on the alliance system, the different alliances. And we saw that last year in Social 10 with the Scramble for Africa, that they met in the Congress of Berlin, and they had decided a peaceful way to carve up Africa. So the hope was that by using diplomacy at this Congress, there's no permanent place for diplomacy, but they would have conferences from time to time. But using diplomacy at this conference, that they might be able to avoid a war as a consequence of imperialism. But still we have the British Empire with a quarter of the Earth's surface, we have the Russian Empire that is a massive empire in Eurasia, and we have others like Italy and Germany that want their place in the sun. And to the Germans, they see themselves as a superior force to the Anglo-Saxons who had fled Germania and have now conquered England and Britain. So to them, it doesn't make sense that the Germanic tribes that could stay and last and thrive on the continent somehow are now the inferior cousins of the Anglo-Saxon British Empire. So the age of imperialism will create a rivalry, and in a zero-sum world, as long as that other rival's empire keeps growing, then yours is shrinking relative to it. Then they understand that direct confrontation is the only way to settle that. And clearly nationalism is one of the four main causes. Nationalism, not necessarily just German nationalism or British or French nationalism, but also nationalism of quote-unquote the lesser peoples living within these empires. So Slavic nationalism in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Slovenia and Croatia, nationalism within what we'll call the powder keg of Europe, the Balkans, whereas we see these young nations trying to be forged from parts of the Austrian, Hungarian, and Ottoman empires. And as they're trying to forge them, the Ottomans, the sick man of Europe, they try to hang on to their territory, but they're unable to do so. The Austrian-Hungarians are trying to even expand their authority in the Balkans, and there's great resistance among the Serbs. And because the Serbs have as their protector the Russians, it creates that entangling alliances that will lead to an escalation of war. Now, the immediate cause, main or the long-term causes, the immediate cause of World War I is clear. It's the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Serbian terrorist Realpolitique on behalf of the Black Hand as an expression of Serb nationalism. So the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that's the immediate cause, but the long-term causes are militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Now, nationalism is what was in the heart of Gabriel Princip, and he's actually recognized as a hero today in Serbia because he is seen as one of those key moments that is trying to push forth their nationhood. Now, we should mention right at the beginning of this war, World War I, that it was seen as a moment to clear the air, and some people were worried that maybe the war would be over before they could even get to the front. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for the war, that it had been decades since there was a major war in Europe among the major powers, and this might be just what was needed to clear the air and to reestablish some peace and order. And they didn't realize that the nature of war had changed. That due to the mechanization of warfare that we begin to see in the American Civil War, because of the mechanization of warfare, there's going to be killing machines that are going to be able to absolutely cut through the defensive lines of your opponents. So at the beginning of the war, in fall of 1914, they had no idea the length of the war, the scope of it, and clearly the cost of the war, in economic cost, but also the human cost of the war. Lots of extras at the end there if you want to take a look and to see more. You can see here that the United States at the beginning of World War I, they're doing their best to avoid being pulled into the war. This cartoon is actually a little after World War I because it shows the League of Nations. League of Nations will be created as a consequence of World War I, so this cartoon might be out of place a little bit, but it is showing the idea that there are some countries in 1914 trying to avoid war. The United States is one of them. They don't want to get involved into a conflict that's not theirs. Here's the root causes of World War I. You can take a longer peek at that. You have nationalism and militarism and imperialism, but you can see that off of nationalism, it's more specific. It's not just nationalism, it's that Franco-Prussian conflict, their rivalry in the War of 1870 and 1871. It's the birth of Italy, it's the Pan-Slavism, and it's the Balkan problems and the rise of Albania and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And that'll be the end of today's lesson.